Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session on disclosure and sustainability. I have to thank the previous panel for setting us up beautifully as a neat shoe-in to what we're going to discuss, although I think they might have stolen some of our thunder, so we'll see. But hopefully emphasis and repetition will really hammer the message home. And I'm delighted to be here with such an expert group of panelists this afternoon. I'm anticipating that we will have a robust discussion. There's a lot of collective expertise here on the subject matter. And the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has been referred to already quite a lot this afternoon. Since Mark Carney made his groundbreaking speech just over a year ago, heralding the formation of the Financial Task Force, he indicated that the recommendations they make will be instrumental in navigating the world's economies and society away from a tragic horizon dominated by significant and dangerous climate change. The Global Roundtable here in Dubai sees just over a month to go before the task force publishes its final recommendations, and those will then go out for public scrutiny for 2 months. Transparency and accountability of market actors are key in assessing and, over time, enhancing the alignment of both commercial with societal objectives. And I think it was said in the last panel that only what can be measured can then be acted upon, and of course progress against targets tracked. Over the last decade, tremendous headway has been made on both voluntary and mandatory levels to improve on and start to standardize the corporate, environmental, social and governance disclosures from financial institutions and from corporate organizations affecting practice in the real economy. However, too often this information is hidden away. It's kept in a sort of black box that quite a lot of us don't have access to. And again, in the last panel, there was a lot of discussion about internal objectives and internal ways organizations actually look at this information. So how is that going to become publicly available information? How are we going to affect this change? The Task Force brought a Phase 1 report out at the end of March of this year, which was effectively a snapshot, a sort of where we are now summary, reviewing current voluntary and mandatory regimes, identifying commonalities, gaps, and of course areas for improvement. The review highlighted the progress which has been made by governments, by stock exchanges, by NGOs, and by many corporate bodies in the context of disclosure frameworks. That, having been presented to the FSB at the end of March, confirmed the task force's remit to support informed investment, credit, and insurance underwriting decisions about reporting companies, and to enable a variety of stakeholders to understand the concentrations of carbon-related assets in the financial sector and the financial system's exposure to climate-related risk. So our session here this afternoon focused on disclosure for sustainability and what the task force is working towards, which we understand is to identify gaps in disclosure and leading disclosure practices, to deliver recommendations that improve consistency and usefulness of climate-related financial information, and to develop a form of an adoption strategy for its recommendations, which, as we know, are going to be voluntary. Our panel here, I'm hoping, is going to examine the need for and the feasibility of the standardization of ESG information and disclosures in the financial sector, and also discuss some of the private and public benefits and the costs of achieving fuller ESG transparency from the financial markets. This last year has seen the beginnings of a real leap forward in the understanding, the disclosure, and the response to climate-related financial risk. the foundations are being laid for more material, more insightful, and more actionable disclosure by companies of climate risk and opportunity. Disclosure which will help inform investment and will change corporate behaviour. But there is still some considerable way to go, and it can be rather a dark art. So I'm anticipating our panel here today are going to shine some light for us into the more shadowy corners and perhaps open the black box and maybe give us some insights into how to make this change actually happen. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and then they're going to give us some insights and their own personal perspective and thoughts on this topic. I'm going to start at the far end with John Williams. John is partner in PwC. He co-leads the corporate team within PwC's sustainability and climate change practice, offering market-leading strategy and implementation, risk management and reporting solutions to companies. He has a particular focus on environmental, social and governance issues, particularly relating to climate change, including both climate finance and carbon markets. His clients include financial institutions in both the developed world and developing economies, and companies in retail, consumer goods, healthcare, energy and mining. And he is a co-chair of the FSB's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and acts as an expert advisor to a major European bank. He was Green Finance Working Group co-chair for the Climate Markets and Investors Association and project advisor to the World Economic Forum for both Critical Mass Initiative and the Energy Access Partnership. He's been chair of the Equator Principles, which is the global benchmark for banks to manage social and environmental issues in project finance, and he chaired the Climate Principles, a framework for the finance sector to respond to climate change. Next to him is Namita Fadness. Namita is the Group President and Managing Director for Climate Strategy and Responsible Banking for Yes Bank Limited. She spearheads Yes Bank's climate action strategy and sustainable development agenda. Ms. Vikas is also the worldwide chairperson of the UN Natural Capital Declaration. They are committed to sustainable development, and on behalf of Yes Bank, she is involved with national and international sustainable finance policy influencing and has been closely associated with the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the UN to drive the climate finance agenda and towards green financing policies. Next to Namita is Julian. Julian Poulter is Chief Executive Officer of the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, which is an independent, non-profit organisation, the world leader on reporting asset owner performance over their management of climate risk. Before entering the non-profit sector in 2007, Julian had a long career in business and finance. He's been CEO of 4 companies in consulting, media and software, and has held many senior executive roles in large organizations. He's managed large-scale projects and operations in diverse industries, including finance and oil and gas, manufacturing, distribution, retail, and IT. Julian left the commercial sector in 2007, having realized the potential for the world's asset owners to take a uniquely long-term view of climate change risks and to help drive solutions where politics was clearly failing. He's been widely published on finance, investment, and general sustainability issues. And then immediately on my left is Jackie Johnson. Jackie is the Group Executive for People, Performance and Reputation at IAG. She reports to the Managing Director and the CEO and is responsible for the functions that come together to drive performance through organizational agility. This includes people and culture, corporate and government affairs, shared value, which includes sustainability, and the IAG Foundation. And previously, Jackie has had responsibility for sustainability and disaster recovery efforts, such as for Christchurch, in her role as CEO New Zealand and CGU. So that's the introductions over. I'd like to ask John to kick us off and to provide us with a summary of the work being done by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, maybe some key highlights and findings, maybe something that Christian didn't tell us in the last session. Over to you, John.
Great. Thanks very much, Jane. And clearly it's the result of good disclosure that she was able to find out so much about me in the introduction. I thought I'd cover three broad things. Firstly, why the task force was set up and what its real objectives are. Secondly, what the report is going to say without breaching any sort of secrecy agreements I may or may not have signed. Thirdly, a little bit about what the sort of initial impact, and this is a personal view of the task force, and then I might just touch a little bit on why it's different to other disclosure regimes that have gone before it. So Jane mentioned in her introduction Mark Carney's Tragedy of the Horizon speech back in September 2015. And essentially what he was worried about was financial stability. And he was seeing climate change through the lens of a financier, of a banker, and saying that when they looked at it, they did not believe the market would smoothly correct to a sort of transition away from high carbon to low carbon economies. And most of you, I'm sure, have read the speech and read the report. But what he did next was very smart, because what he did was he asked the private sector to come up with the rules. Invited Michael Bloomberg to chair the task force, and then a number of us were invited in to support that process. And my role was to co-chair the financials work stream with some other sort of individuals. What the theory of change behind the task force is as follows. If you want to improve the management of a transition from a high carbon to low carbon, you need people focused on better risk management in the way you would any other large economic transition, and you need people focused on all of the opportunities for new investment. And the task force is trying to say, what is the right framework to achieve that transition? And the principle is that if something is disclosed, then sitting behind that will be measurement and management. And therefore disclosure is really the tip of the iceberg which forces the changes within the organisation. And essentially, improved disclosure of carbon-related asset risk and climate risk is what it's all about. The other challenge is around consistency and comparability. So one of the principles of the task force is to say we want to create global comparability of disclosures, and we want them to be consistent over time so that the market can manage that data better than if there was a lot of bottom-up, very different disclosures. But it very much builds on the work done by others over the last decade. So again, what we didn't want to do was just to become another disclosure standard for both non-financial and financial companies to have to respond to. So as Jane said, we've been trying to fill the gaps. And critically, this is about financial disclosure. So when people ask me to describe that, I say, I'm partly interested in knowing the carbon emissions of a company, but what I really want to know is the financial impact of those emissions under different tax and price scenarios in different parts of the world. Because I really want to know what it means for revenues, for profit and loss, for cash flow, and for balance sheet. That's the financial disclosures that the market needs. So sort of moving on to what the report will say, essentially the recommended disclosures are going to fall into four broad buckets: governance, strategy, risk management, and then metrics. So there's nothing too dissimilar to many other reporting regimes. Within governance, very interested in the role of the board, the role of the audit committee, the role of management in terms of managing climate risks. For strategy, what does it mean for your business model, your financial plan, and your strategy under different scenarios? And I want to come back to scenarios because that is one area the task force is quite different. Thirdly, under risk management, how do you identify climate and carbon asset risk in portfolios? How do you manage them? How do you mitigate them? And how do you integrate that into your broader risk management framework? And then finally, under metrics and targets, how do you disclose your governance, your strategy, and your risk management through an agreed set of metrics and targets that can be reviewed by the board and disclosed as any other financial information would be? And I think the other critical change is that the disclosures will be through the financial statements. And the reason that that recommendation is in there is very much that we want climate to be treated as any other issue. And if you're a board of a company or a board of a financial institution and you have a material impact on your business, you would put that through a financial disclosure process, through an audit committee, and make that disclosure to the market. So we're treating climate as any other financial disclosure. I mentioned scenarios. One of the recommendations will be to look at the impact of different climate scenarios on your strategy, business plan, financial plan, including a 2 degrees scenario. So what would a 2 degree policy world mean for the value of assets if you're an asset manager or an asset owner, possibly the credit quality of lending if you're a bank? And whilst there'll be guidance on the methodology, we are not being prescriptive about the scenarios you have to do. The recommendation is do those that work for your business in the industry and the region you are, but reference them to 2 degrees scenario, so consistent with the Paris Agreement. Obviously, the other thing to recognise if you're a financial institution is you are both a user of disclosures. The only way you can understand the risks and opportunities that lie across your portfolio is to have companies that you invest in or lend to or underwrite disclosing to you, but you will also be disclosers or preparers yourself. So how do you then aggregate up from an asset to a client to a portfolio to an institutional level, and the challenges of doing that? I guess then sort of final thing I'll touch on is what does the forward plan look like? We really only started work after COP21 when Michael Bloomberg agreed to take on the job, and really not until sort of January, February time. And a lot of the work has been done, really in phase 2 to form the recommendations. We had a very good meeting 2 weeks ago in London of the task force. We've agreed pretty much all of the substantive issues. A lot of effort going in at the moment to finalise the drafting of the report. And that report will go to the FSB on the 17th of November. And it'll go as a final draft for their agreement. Assuming that they agree, and they've been involved throughout the process, so we see no signs that they won't. That report will then be released in the first or second week of December, publicly for consultation, and after 60 days, those comments will be taken back into the drafting process, and a final report will be given to the G20 finance ministers in March 2017. So when I think about what does that mean for participants in the market, both financial and non-financial, really the substantive framework for climate disclosure across the G20 will be released within the next 3 weeks. I don't see there being massive changes as it goes through the approval process, because we've kept the FSB very closely involved in the work that we've been doing. The other thing that's important to understand is the FSB has no ability to mandate. And whilst we could all say that regulation will be the best way to achieve disclosure on the scale that the task force wishes, the FSB doesn't have that power. But given the people who are on the FSB, they have considerable influence across the G20, and particularly with the finance ministers and central bank governors. So although I don't see regulation in the short to mid-term, I think it's likely that investors, ratings agencies, proxy agencies will very much use that framework on a sort of a disclose or explain basis. So either you are disclosing in accordance with the recommendations, or if you're not, please explain to us why you can't do that. And therefore I think the market pressure will come before the regulatory pressure. I think some countries will move faster where they already have legislation in place. Others will perhaps move a little bit slower, and we know there are at least a couple of countries who are unlikely to welcome the report or will be neutral at best. So I think the challenge that you have if you're a global financial institution is bringing together those different levels of disclosure, both for yourself but also for the companies and the clients you invest and lend to. The final thing I'll say is, why is this different to anything that has gone before it? In the phase 1 report, we said there were some 400 disclosure regimes, both voluntary and regulatory, and we didn't want to become the 401st. There are really four things that stick out in my mind. One is industry-led. These recommendations have been put together by both high carbon emitting industries and by the financial services sector. So this is actually an agreement, if you like, drawn from a range of sectors and G20 countries. Secondly, it's sponsored by the G20 and by the G20 finance ministers, and therefore that does give a considerable weight and a degree of governance around its implementation. Thirdly, they're financial disclosures in financial filings, and that is very important in terms of the disclosure and governance regimes that this will go to, and also giving it the same rigour as any other financial disclosure. And then finally, they're forward-looking, using scenarios. So it's not about measuring the past, it's about saying, what might my business look like if policy measures to achieve 2 degrees of global warming are achieved, and what impact will that have on my business?
John, thank you very much. I think that was really very insightful, and I think incredibly encouraging. If I could actually jump forward to Jackie now. Jackie, could you perhaps give us some perspective from the insurance industry and how the disclosure debate is moving forward within insurance, which to my mind has always been actually well ahead of the game on dealing with climate risk?
Yeah, and I do feel that some of my thunder was stolen too by Allianz and AXA on the previous panel. And for those that don't know Insurance Australia Group, we are predominantly Australian, New Zealand based insurer, lead in our markets, but we also have operations in Thailand, Malaysia, joint venture in India, and also with Indonesia and Vietnam. So if you think about that part of the world, we're quite exposed to quite a lot of natural perils, and a lot of them are climate related. And to give context, we're a bit smaller than AIG that we often get confused for in the global markets, but we would collect about $12 billion of premium, and we would pay out in the last year around $9 billion related to various natural disasters. And we insure around $1.2 trillion worth of assets. Last week we had our AGM, and our AGM is quite interesting because we're 16-year-old as a company because we demutualised, but we've got 150-year-old brands across all our markets. And we have about 700,000 mums and dads who are shareholders, and all our investors from global investors as well as some local investors. But it was the actual mums and dads that asked the question of our chairman and our board about climate risk in our portfolio. Now, you would have thought that a lot more of the investment bankers would have asked the question, but it actually came from the mums and dads. And I just want to highlight that because we often talk about the big investment markets, but I think there is a growing consciousness around the public about who that they want to be associated with. And we were talking before that actually a lot of our shareholders who are mums and dads might only have 100 shares each because they got them in a demutualisation. So I think we have to face that in the world. Insurance at its essence, our products really do help economies, both local and globally, but also individuals, both for their businesses and their households, not only recover from climate risk when something bad has happened, but actually can go on and thrive if they have had the right insurance protecting them. And we see our goal in terms of climate risk is to make sure that insurance is available and affordable, which means you have to manage both sides of your balance sheet. Because if you don't do that, then you're not around for the people who really need it when the climate change risks are eventuating. And when I think about the comments that were made by Mark Carney, and particularly about once climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it's probably too late. I get very concerned, given what we see as an insurer, that we are probably at a pivotal point, if not now, certainly in the next few years, if we don't take action. And certainly we see that in Australia and New Zealand with the amount of weather events that have been increasing in frequency and the ferociousness of those events, even in the last month. And so what we see is that we deal with that reality, but importantly, it's operationally what we do as well. And so I want to cover why it has been easier for us on a disclosure regime to handle the operational risks, the underwriting risks, if you like, where we're having a harder time on the disclosure issues about our investments, and I just want to pull those two issues apart for the next few minutes. So when we think about our purpose as a company, we galvanise our 15,000 employees about we want to make the world a safer place, and that resonates very well for all our people and our supply chain partners and our distribution partners. And the work we've done to try and make that real internally has been reducing our own impacts. So 2012 we became carbon neutral, and we have set a target to improve our carbon footprint by another 10% by 2020, absolute. And that's things like our premises, our procurement, our supply chain management, and actually behaviours internally in terms of fuel, paper and electricity use and waste. And one of the things that we've seen is that's really galvanised our people internally, and they're starting to ask us questions about what we invest in. And this is from the junior claims person right through to our senior leaders saying, I really value where I work for and what you believe, but we can't just see it on one side of our balance sheet. We do invest in a natural perils team that helps understand risk and climate risk in particular, and how we embed that into our underwriting decisions and the decisions where we engage different communities. We were a founder of the Australian Business Roundtable for disaster resilience and safer communities, and the same in New Zealand, where we actually use that to collect data and influence government at a federal and a state level. We've influenced our supply chain, so through things like EcoSmash, where we give transparency to our smash repairers, who are all small businesses predominantly, about their own carbon footprint and what we expect them to do to stay a gold repairer, to repair the cars of our customers. And we're doing quite a lot in our supply chain. And we also believe on intensive advocacy and disclosure initiatives in terms of things like the Dow Jones Index, which we have been recognised in year on year, and FTSE for Good. The challenge that we have, and we support our communities through some of our partners that are not-for-profits, such as State Emergency and Red Cross and Lifeline. But now I want to come with the challenge, because that's not good enough. We're only looking at one side of our balance sheet. And we do take the challenge that's come out of the work that's been doing, that as an insurance industry, and we're more general insurance with more short-tail business, where our claims get paid generally within 6 to 12 months, why aren't we disclosing as much as we do on all our other risks? Why are we not doing that when we do collect the information about our investments? And some of it's behaviourally, in terms of if you're the only one disclosing and there isn't a clear framework for people to compare, you can actually be disadvantaged in the financial markets. And that is something that we've been coming to terms with. We had our answers ready at the AGM when we were asked about our exposure, particularly to coal mines in our investment portfolio, and it's 0.1%. But we do insure coal mines for workers' compensation, because for us, ESG is quite complex, isn't it? We can take a moral high ground, but we can pull out insuring the coal mines in Australia, and then workers who are working in those environments do not have workers' compensation cover. And we don't think that's ethical. So we would rather work with that industry and work with the state governments who govern workers' compensation to influence safety standards, and then this transition piece that we talk about. Because I think we're talking about some very complex issues if we just suddenly pull out our investments. The reality for us is, because of the nature of being a general insurer and our prudential regulator, 2/3 of our investment is in short-term fixed interest and bonds. And then the other third is what we'd have, which is more our shareholders' funds. What we're exploring is, can we actually, through transparency, create resilience bonds that actually help with our work on our roundtable for disaster recovery, so that we start to partner with government about, they do policy, and between ourselves, Munich Re and one of the banks in Australia, really look at how we could fund some infrastructure that helps with disaster resilience more. And then we have to say, well, what would that mean for us in terms of how we're moving our assets into those sort of vehicles, rather than just the third that we do place on the investment market. but predominantly we're needing a behavioural change internally and externally, and it's why we embrace the voluntary reporting framework, and we're quite excited about how we work through that, because we've found by being part of the PSI in terms of the insurance framework, that galvanised our organisation over the last 7 years to actually have more disclosure and quite critical behavioural change internally, and we're hoping that will be the same with the voluntary reporting on assets. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. That was a really interesting perspective, and I think in some ways quite challenging on demonstrating the difficulties that and the complexities of ESG disclosure and reporting. Namita, if we could perhaps look at it now through the lens of a bank who is actually dealing with green investment and moving its investment portfolio more and more into the green space.
Thanks, thank you very much. I think, when I am into these discussions, I see as this big wave, and banks are one entity which are trying to solve this complex issue, because there are practicalities that are really on ground that need to be addressed. So, disclosure mechanisms within banks and has been on the move, on the rise, especially within the developing markets, because there the problem is far more complex, given that the clients themselves do not have mechanisms to capture ESG data. So there have been multidimensional forms that are emerging, and this could be an indication of growth and the progress of a particular entity that's going through this whole journey, or have been as a catalyst to draw investments, source cheaper capital, mitigate reputational risks. So when we really look at the real economy players globally, companies are adopting non-financial disclosures more and more, and therefore data is becoming available. So at the first level, that's really the first point here. And what is really meaningful is that with the TCFD coming into play, there would be some kind of a standardization that will come about really, and the accountability is only going to be on the rise. Now with SDGs and the Paris Accord, governments are really looking at creating this whole, actually deciphering what is this label sustainable. So when you say sustainable, what is really the label, what does it mean, what are the impacts of the investments, and it is also necessary to now enhance the disclosure mechanisms from country standpoint. So therefore, in a way, transparency and accountability for banks is enhancing, and there needs to be an alignment with the real economy players, given that investors are more and more looking at exposures of banks. So bank A's exposure may be much higher than a bank B, and if the data is available, then that gives some kind of a level playing field, visibility, confidence in the ROI, and further value creation, because it's not just limited to ROI, but it's really going beyond to value creation. But now let's look at reality. In reality, all this is really at times limited to sorry, I have a bad throat. So this is all limited to a kind of a templatized approach, a checkbox exercise if there is some kind of a law that is there, and unless there is a strong business case that is established within the banks, this may not happen. So while we would have certain standards at country level, there needs to be a business case and a level playing field. This also at times reflects on the inadequate risk management systems that are there. Now there's no study that shows a correlation between non-ESG management and non-performing assets, but we've seen that those who just look at credit worthiness, there are loans that have gone bad in the whole tenor. So there is really a need to enhance this whole mechanism at an organizational level, at a sector level, and then at a country level, or maybe top down or bottoms up, whichever way, but that's really required. If you look at Yes Bank, we have been of course a little high on our entire ESG management. Green bonds, we issued 3 successive green bonds, And all through the discussions of the investors, the focus was on ESG disclosures. So, there is a high level of importance that is given to these. I mean, 70% of the discussions happened around, how the ESG is going to be managed and how you're going to disclose it. However, that's just one product, because green bonds have its own limitations, very innovative, but we need to then go to tagging of green assets which are in the retail space. So that becomes actually very important when we look at the whole portfolio. Also, how do you reduce the negative impact? Coal is not going to go away from India. So while at an individual level we may have a minuscule exposure towards coal, how do you bring in coal technologies, I mean clean coal technologies? So that needs to be really the focus, which then can come out in your disclosures as a strategic approach to what you're doing, or of course renewable energy, so on and so forth. However, I think there are challenges around. We have standards, we have principles, but there are some minimum standards that need to be there to make the data available. That will really reflect in the bank's overall disclosure strategy. So we have seen Asian stock exchanges who are today demanding ESG performance and risks in order to improve, the Asia's region's historically weak record on ESG disclosures. Also, one very important aspect, and John did mention that in terms of annual reporting, so it's very good. It's nice to hear that the sustainability parameters will get integrated within the annual reporting, because at the end of the day, there's no point in bringing out two reports. There's an annual report and there's a sustainability report, but there needs to be a compilation of all this data really that one needs to look at. I think the third point that I want to highlight here, which is very important and which we face all the time, is climate literacy. How do you actually bring everybody up the curve? There are sustainability teams that exist, but what is the correlation of the sustainability teams with the rest of the bank? That becomes very important. We've seen in cases where there is a ESG policy in place, but in terms of implementation or in terms of disclosures, that's not really, they're not talking to each other. So, we have a whole, in banks, most of the banks have trainings for financial products, but do we have training for ESG, which is a formal platform that is created to get everybody up the curve? So that is a very important aspect, and not just at internal level, but also at an external level where investors. So if you look at what are so there has to be a demand for the supply, right? I mean, if there is a demand by the investors on disclosures, there will be supply. So educating the investors becomes very important. Even to a degree where governments need to be spoken about what should be a country's green finance strategy. So I think that policy advocacy role by banks also becomes very, very crucial, which we have been doing and which has translated into some positive action in terms of policy improvements in the country. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Namita. And I think you have brought out a couple of issues which are, there is a big knowledge gap. The whole issue of climate literacy and climate competence at the decision-making level of companies and institutions, particularly at board level, I think is something that is now being recognised. And I know the task force have been addressing this whole issue of climate competence, and only by enabling people to understand will this actually be accepted as a critical part of business strategy and business decision making, along with all the other strategic issues that boards have to deal with. And not let it be sidelined continually over to the sustainability team, because actually they are not the decision makers. So finally, definitely not least, last but not least, Julian, I think if you could give us some perspectives looking at it from the viewpoint of the NGOs, addressing what can investors and other financial actors actually be doing better in terms of disclosing their exposure. And again, I think this brings us back to understanding of climate risk, and specifically looking forward, which again, in the last panel session, Christian emphasized very strongly is, and John has re-emphasized in the task force, is looking at how you actually demonstrate that you are looking forward and providing a strategic roadmap effectively to deal with this risk.
Thanks, Jane, and lovely to be here. And a pleasure to be at an investor conference where the word Trump doesn't appear every sort of 5 minutes. But apparently he's going to cancel climate change anyway, although he did say it was a plot by the Chinese, amongst other things. But assuming Donald's wrong, and we have to address this issue, we started in around about, funny enough, just before the financial crisis, and perhaps I'll just precursor my comments by saying I think the financial system overall is still in a bit of a mess. I don't think a great deal has happened since the 2008 crisis. That should have been a wake-up call, and in fact since then we were saying this could happen all over again, but with climate change. So it was just if anyone was really overjoyed to hear Mark Carney's speech, I can promise you that it was me, along with plenty of other people. But to hear that similar systemic comparison, I think, was very important, because the issue comes down to whether or not you have a belief in relatively short-term markets to price a long-term risk. So looking around the room, the chances are that there's quite a few people who are around about perhaps more than 20 years away from retirement. Actually, the closer I get to it, the further it seems to go away. That's probably the case for most people. But the average pension fund has around about a 20-year time horizon. And so the growth in the financial markets has been fed by the huge explosion in retirement funds of one sort or another, whether that be state funds, mutual funds, or whatever. The trouble is that the middle layer has remained particularly short-term. And we've not yet found a way to reconnect the dots. And that's why the Asset Owners Disclosure Project was set up. I originally went to CDP and said that they should do asset owner disclosure, but they said that they were conflicted. Naturally be having a lot of investor signatories. And so we started to look really at what the true long-term investors were going to do about climate risk, given that they were the only ones really incentivized. And so by long-term, by asset owner, we mean the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, insurance companies, and I suppose you can include foundations and endowments on top of that. Organisations who have a genuine concern to manage climate risk, and indeed other systemic risks, and not just rely on short-term markets for their risk price point. And that's the key. Their view of how they hedge their portfolios really comes down to what John said about the chances of a smooth transition. Now, next year, 2017, according to the IEA, is the last year where anybody can build any 2-degree infrastructure, i.e., anyone building non-compliant infrastructure past the end of next year will face stranded asset scenarios in a 2-degree world. Now, you can take your bets as to whether or not you think we'll actually get to a 2-degree world. We're at 1 now. There's half a degree built into the system, into the atmospheric system. So we don't have very long at all to compress, from an emissions perspective, this transition. And even though there's recent progress on policy, we're still quite away from implementation. And it still seems likely that the acceleration period that Mark Carney talked about, when he talked about the wholesale reassessment of prospects, is perhaps some years away. But the issue for an investor is when they pick that reacceleration period. And so as a fund manager invested in the short term and at the coalface of both equity and bond markets, I might say, well, where are we right now? Well, look, John's going to produce his report in November. The COP agreement is getting ratified, but strictly implementation doesn't really start until 2020. So I don't really need to sort of worry about this issue for another couple of years. But as a pension fund and as a genuine long-term investor, I need to say, well, it's a pretty big gamble, perhaps bigger than the one I took in 2008. It's a pretty big gamble to say, I'm going to wait for my ever so clever fund managers to wait to just before that acceleration of the risk price point, and then I'm going to trade out. That is the key decision a long-term investor has to make. And if they don't have the faith in that middle layer to trade out profitably, and why should they? Because the reality is, as soon as somebody starts to trade out of that, everyone else will trade out as well. Then they have to have a next decision to make, which is, do I hedge my portfolio? And that's what we've been looking at for the last 10 years. I don't know if it's on the screen there, but we essentially rate the leaders and separate the industry for the top 500 asset owners into leaders and laggards, and it's been a very interesting journey. The leaders are actually several percent underweight carbon in their portfolios for no return sacrifice at all. And that was an interesting discovery that we've been making in the last few years. They are people who have taken an early punt on screening out perhaps coal and tar sands, the highest exposures. Some of them are even underweight certain oil stocks. In the long term, I think the Western listed oil market is dead. The only place we're going to get profitable oil out of is the Middle East. So these are people that are taking longer term views of these things. It was interesting to hear Christian talk about risk return hurdles. I think it's really interesting when we talk about using the same risk return hurdles for renewable energy that we have always used. Because when I talk to renewables companies, they're busy trying to get through their business models, and so we're trying to persuade people to have a forward-looking case for carbon to make our current projects look more attractive. And it's the lenders and the investors who are saying, no, there's no certainty on that. So this glass half full, glass half empty issue is a real problem for companies looking to actually essentially create the clean economy. A couple more things. One is that anything that creates greenhouse gases, carbon, is capital intensive. Power stations, fossil fuel mining facilities, and so forth. And so this uncertainty looking forward over 25-year assets about what the carbon price will be or its intrinsic regulatory equivalent, right, because you can essentially equate everything to a carbon price, is very, very tricky indeed. The problem is that we favour the status quo over taking a forward case. And what we've said to the long-term investors more than anything is, if you can't be certain of years 15 to 25, say, why do you favour the status quo? Why do you not say, well, actually, it's just as bad that we're invested in these 25-year assets now and they might be unprofitable, and our fund managers are trading off the back of that status quo right now. And so really only the asset owners can have those sort of very, very difficult conversations and drive change right down the chain through the fund management layer to the companies where disclosure doesn't really have a great deal of impact. And in fact, there's what a great job CDP has done in gathering the data. But actually, of course, Exxon doesn't need to prove it can diversify, whereas a portfolio manager does. And that's why I think we're all looking forward to John's report, and hopefully that has a requisite impact on these long-term investors.
Julian, thank you. I think that really has been a relatively deep dive into some of the issues, and just sort of drawing some of the nuggets of wisdom out of the four panelists' contributions there. Something I just want to focus on, which Namita actually brought up, which is this challenge between disclosure from companies, then sectors, and then actually escalating that right up to countries. And I'd really like to sort of throw that one over to John, actually, in whether the task force is addressing those very different but strongly related issues, and how are we going to end up with something, a sort of one-size-fits-all, or aren't we? Is that going to be a different approach?
I suspect the ability to build a bottom-up global balance sheet of where climate risk and carbon exists for every country and every sector is a dream that will probably be impossibly expensive to get to. The way the task force approaches it is as follows. And I've said this before, why is it when you introduce the words climate change do we become emotional and irrational, where any other risk which was material, would be assessed, identified and managed? So what the task force is saying is you need to understand where your material climate and carbon risks sit within the portfolios that you have under your control. It may be an individual client that's facing distress because of climate policy. It could be a portfolio you've insured, residential houses in a floodplain where you've got some concentrations of physical risk. Or it could be some litigation risk that you're facing. But understanding where those risks are and then saying under different scenarios, different stress tests, if I can use that word, what do those risks look like in financial terms, and how am I going to manage those risks down as far as I can? How am I going to provide for those that I can't manage or take out other risk management instruments and then disclose what I'm doing so the market has confidence I'm managing that risk? And if you were faced with a secondary end mortgage exposure concentration, you would have done all of that and you would have disclosed to investors how you were working through that problem. And then we add the word climate change, which is many times bigger, and we suddenly start debating the science and saying it's all too hard. So what I would say is get your hands around what you can manage today, because you can look at your energy book, your residential mortgage book, your mining book. Do it bottom up if you can, and then disclose what is my risk management framework, what would be the financial implications, and if it's material, what am I doing to manage it? And so I think it will be that sort of, very risk and materiality focused disclosure, rather than trying to add up the global climate financial balance sheet, which ultimately wouldn't give you the answer you want anyway.
Thank you. Looking at financial institutions themselves, Namita, would you sort of just think about for us what disclosure is going to do for the financial institutions themselves? So it's not just an advantage of them understanding what companies that they may invest in are doing in this space, but what about the actual banks and of course the insurance companies? Is this going to benefit them within their own strategic management of risk?
Yes, I think it would certainly, because, in a way, like John has mentioned, disclosures is ultimately connected with risk management. So it is about how do you manage your risks, because you're monitoring, managing the risk at the end of the day, and that's what you're putting out. Now, another way of looking at it is, one is, of course, with multilateral sourcing capital that I mentioned about. Second is, how do you then look at innovative products that you want to actually create for the market? That's an opportunity that gets thrown up when you look at your own portfolio of what is required to be done. So that's really a very important area where there is a kind of a market that you look to serve. So I would like to just cite an example here. Affordable housing is something that is a core area for which our bank is focusing on. And when we looked at our own disclosures, the ESG parameters that we captured when we looked at this particular segment, what threw up was that the internet connectivity with the target market is very poor. So what we did was we innovated with a Taiwanese company on a slim sleeve. It's a sleeve that gets fit onto the SIM card, which enables internet activation for mobile banking. So there's a target segment. It's a $700 million market out there in India with 400 million smartphone users who don't have access to internet connection. So there is an opportunity that gets created from these kind of disclosures. And I just want to add one more point earlier on here. So the G20 Green Finance Study Group parallelly has also looked at certain elements in terms of advising governments, because at the end of the day, while we say that risk management and how do you look at your entire risk management as a comprehensive strategy, there is ultimately a push from the regulator to look at certain areas. So, everybody in India is today moving to Basel III because that's the target here. And stress testing of portfolios is a Basel III requirement. If we have environment stress testing also incorporated into that, then that gets happened. So I think that is really a very important aspect where there has to be a push and pull, where there is a push by the regulator, but also by a pull from an overall how sustainable does an organization want to be?
Thank you. One thing I think is worth just touching on here is the whole issue of governance. And Jackie, I would think in your role, that is something that you're dealing with, all the time. So do you see this, and particularly in light of the task force's recommendations imminently going to be publicly available, do you see this as being an issue that will become a common approach through governance, or do you think it's going to be a really hard sell?
I think it will be mixed, and I think, I look at governance for our own companies, but then I think about insurance. We insure directors' liability, for example, and companies for the decisions they're making. So insurers have to see on both sides. And for me, it comes back to that identification, assessment and management of risk. If boards aren't really asking the right questions, and that piece about climate literacy, then you're actually leaving companies exposed to being held negligent for not making the right decisions. And we could be negligent as insurers, but also then you're looking at companies you might be insuring for the decisions they're making. And we often get into debates, particularly with local governments, about decisions they make on urban planning. And if you think about good governance, why is it that often the socially disadvantaged are getting the cheaper land that's most exposed to climate change? So under transparency, we've released a lot of data to customers where they can go on and look at their address and see what the exposures are for them before they're making a decision. That doesn't earn you a lot of respect from real estate agents and sometimes local councils who are actually getting funding through rates. So I think governance threads through on so many levels, both at the planning level, the company level, and then who are making the decisions.
Thank you. Now, I am aware that this session has been slightly compressed, but I'd like to ask a question for Julian, and then perhaps open it up to the floor to see if you have questions to ask our panellists, as I think we need to finish up in about 10 minutes. But Julian, one thing that I'd really like to perhaps address is we're talking about the task force's recommendations, which are going to be voluntary, and I think there's been a real consensus both in the previous panel and this one that is the way forward. However, there is a role for policy and regulation in this debate, and a very active one. So I'd love your perspective on that and the whole way that can be used to encourage ESG disclosure, specifically the financial sector perspective.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's made the subprime crisis a hobby, I've read every one of the Financial Stability Board's papers after the 2008 crisis, and there was no talk then of voluntary disclosure. What we lack here and what we lack around climate change actually is a crisis, right? The problem is that it's very, very slowly, sort of frog in the boiling water time, becoming worse and worse. And the insurers are the people who know that if we do get to 2 degrees is not a linear point. It's not like we'll get to 2.5 and we may be able to stop it. The point about this issue is it might get to 2 and may not be able to stop 4. And so we have to understand what the FSB does, and of course we need mandatory disclosure. But I think what this will do is it will trigger investors in the same way that they turned up in record numbers at the Exxon AGM this year. And Exxon has become a proxy for how investors deal with this issue from an active ownership perspective. And they turned up and voted 38%, and next year they'll turn up again and there'll be 60. And I think the investors will say, actually, thank you FSB, you've done your job, we know what the guidelines are, and now we're going to use this for extra courage to turn up at AGMs and demand that you give us the data we need. And actually, I'm a bit more optimistic about this top-down database, John, of emissions perhaps than you are. And I think only then, once you get the data, then the long-term investors can say, okay, what is my point carbon position, and how do I hedge it over a long period of time using a base case, whatever that may be.
Thank you. So I think we may have actually generated quite a few questions there, or hopefully we have. We've got time just to take a couple before the end of the session. Does anybody have a particular question for our panelists here? Completely thrown you into astonishment and silence.
Can make it difficult.
There's one right.
Is there one? Sorry, I can't see.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Good afternoon. We've heard a lot about 2-degree stress tests and the disclosure of that, but ultimately this information is only valid if you action it and turn it into a transition plan, right? Because the 2-degree stress test tells you how much you're exposed and how much of that is material, but then the next stage is, okay, how do we use this information to transition? So I was wondering if you could give a bit of information as to how the TCFD has been looking into that, and if this is not coming out, what were the tensions there with respect to this? Because ultimately, I mean, data is just one thing, what you need is information, right? And so that nuance is one that I wanted to get a bit more information on.
John, I think that might be one for you.
So hopefully I've heard it correctly, but it was really not just about the stress test, but how that stress test should be used in terms of managing the sort of broader climate risk, if I understand it, and to what extent the TCFD has sort of looked at that. We've spent a huge amount of time looking at scenarios and trying to decide which one is the best one. We're trying to get the balance between being very prescriptive and therefore scoring on comparability, but recognizing that different scenarios will play out at different times in different sectors in different parts of the world, so you need to leave some flexibility. So what the report will have will be a technical annex on methodologies for doing scenarios, and as well as some sort of data points that you should report, particularly around your assumptions, price points you've chosen for commodities, for carbon, etc. But doing a scenario is sort of the first bit. And what the recommendations will say is the scenario should then inform your business strategy. So what are you going to do as a result of that scenario? So if you believe 2 degrees is achievable and this is the impact in the various markets where you've got exposure, then what are you going to do in terms of your strategy, your asset allocation if you're an asset owner? What are you going to do in terms of your sort of business plan, and how does it affect your financial plan? And then how do you integrate that into the way you, having identified that as a risk, you assess it, you manage it, and you mitigate it. So really the scenario analysis sits at the start of a sort of strategy reformulation. Now you may do a scenario analysis and say, actually, we're pretty good in all scenarios. There's one that might concern us a bit, but as a diversified financial, we are happy to take that level of value at risk because we've got sufficient broader provisions to cover it. Or you might say there is a scenario which is particularly painful for us in a particular sector or a market, and we're going to work with our clients in those sectors to help them with their transition plans, because let's be honest, most companies are not blind to this, and as a provider of capital, there's an opportunity for us to help them through that transition, lowering risk to us as a provider of finance and preserving that client relationship. So actually, I think you're absolutely right. Scenarios is the start. It actually informs that sort of strategy risk management response. So I hope that was the sort of the answer you were after, and that's the framing we're giving scenarios within the report.
Can I add something? And it's about what we do with those scenarios, because investment is a pretty blunt instrument, and we should remember that a large amount of capital is run in passive equities. And in fact, all the US mutual market is a tiny percentage of it is managed actively. Actually, companies are better at transitions than investors are. Investors tend to withdraw the capital, give the capital. And that's why the active ownership piece is going to be so critical for the oil companies. They have maybe 1 or 2 years to prove to their investors they can come up with a transition plan. But they are the change managers, right? They are business managers. They know how to transform a company and they can change. The question is, whether or not the long-term investors will drive the fund managers to force them to change. And if that doesn't happen, then I think we'll get greater resistance because their policy influence is very high, and then I think that's going to push back the curve in the 2020s, and we face a much tighter stranded asset scenario.
Thank you, Julian. So I think we've probably got time for one quick question at the back there.
Thank you very much for your insightful discussion. I think you put the finger on the issue about awareness and integrating ESG within the executive committee discussions. And I wanted to have your practical insights from your personal experience on how you actually do that and really making environmental and social risk embedded within, especially in the banking sector, how it's actually integrated in decision making. Thank you.
So I'll just give you the India scenario. So we have really adopted a three-pronged approach, if I may say. So there are three stakeholder groups that one would look at: the regulators or the policymakers, the external other banks, because if we follow ESG parameters, then we need the level playing field. So we want everybody to look at that scenario. Otherwise, there are 19 banks that finance in India, and if they don't ask for these questions, anybody who asks gets bumped off. And third is the internal, the risk management teams, or the diversified human capital that's there. So those are the three scenarios. So what we did was, with the first contingent, at the policy level, we've engaged with the Indian Banks Association, the GIZ, in the lead, to formulate certain responsible investment principles and guidelines, which are voluntary. We don't want a notification from the regulator because we don't want tick box. So those principles are already put together after a deep consultation, and now there are large public sector banks which are testing it, test pilot within their organizations, because we really want those kind of entities to follow it. So that's at the first level. The second level is the external audiences. So what we've done is, along with, in fact, UNEP-FI, we've got the UNEP-FI experts to come to India and organized sessions with other bankers to make them understand how cash flows will get impacted if you've not looked at, say, ESG parameters, and how disclosures become important in terms of really from a reputational risk standpoint. And that's gone very well, because that dovetails back into this whole policy mechanism. A kind of a voluntary recommendation would be made, and then there are other financial institutions which would be geared to appreciate why they should incorporate it within their organizations. As far as the internal resource capacity building is concerned, what we've done is, there are three modules that are there at the bank at three different levels. So at an entry level, anybody who enters at the bank gets a very basic kind of exposure to ESG risks. That's the first. It's an E module where there's an assessment at the end, so you cannot don't complete your formalities unless you undertake that training. At the next level, there are risk management teams and the corporate finance, the project finance teams, who actually are the biggest users of these kind of techniques. They go through a rigorous training. And then at the next level, so what we've done is, in India, we've not seen this, where we don't have environment social risk analysts sitting in credit risk teams. So at Yes Bank, we have this group of people who are a part of the credit team, and they go through extensive trainings, maybe through UNEP-FI or our own electronic modules that we've created. So there has to be a kind of a collaboration with HR, where we've seen here, which is very useful, where there are different kind of engagements that we do to understand why this is important. So that's how we've been educating and building awareness to a degree now, where the project finance teams come to us asking whether is this an ESG risk? Do you think we need to look at it? So that's the kind of awareness that is being built slowly.
Thank you very much. So I think I'd better wrap up. Just for me to say thank you to our fantastic panelists. I think they really have shone some light into the shadowy recesses. and are all doing some amazing work in this space, and to thank the organisers of this round table.